something in my chest that I can't hide. When feelings get involved, I'm terrified. 'Cause I've been here before and said goodbye. Oh, are you the one when I try to look, I wish I'd find? Oh, how can I love when I've been hurt 100 times? But you would give it one more try. Turn away and wrestle with my doubts. Oh, I leave them all behind, but don't know how. Bury my head deep within the crowd, but I'm reaching for your hand to pull me out. Oh, are you the one when I try to look, I wish I'd find? Oh, how can I love when I've been hurt 100 times?
All right, hello everybody. Good evening. Hey Nambro, how is it going? Glad to see you come in. Finally getting back to this. I haven't been able to read in this book in a week because life happens. So here we are. We are a third of the way through this chapter, and I think we're going to get another third of the way through tonight because it's incredibly long chapter. That will leave us with 3 more readings from this book. So, after the reading tonight, I'm going to put up the poll for the next book, and we'll see. I'll give you all 4 choices and see where we go. Right now, I don't really have any ideas. Well, I've got 1 idea, maybe 2. Anyway, here we go. So, this is the realm of spirits. So we were talking about spirits and ghosts and poltergeists and that sort of thing. So, here we go. Let us consider a recent and fairly well-authenticated case of communication with the dead, the one recounted by Bishop James Pike in his book, The Other Side. How's my sound? Okay, yeah. The story Bishop Pike tells is blah, blah, blah. You can tell I haven't read in a week. The story Bishop Pike tells is briefly this. In the mid-60s, his son, Jim, age 20, had been experimenting with psychedelic drugs in San Francisco. These produced some bad trips. In February 1966, Jim Pike locked himself in a New York hotel room and shot himself with a rifle. Various friends had a powerful sense of something wrong, at about the time he killed himself. After his son's death, poltergeist phenomena began to occur in Bishop Pike's apartment, which he was sharing with his chaplain, David Barr, and his secretary, Maren Bergrud. Bergrud, I'm not sure. First of all, books and letters would be arranged at an angle to one another in places where they would be seen. Then part of the bangs on Mrs. Bergrud's forehead was burnt off during the night. The son Jim had never liked her bangs. The missing hair had vanished. The next day, still more of the bangs had disappeared. The following day, she woke up in pain with two of her fingernails injured, as if a needle had been driven under them. One of them later came off. Mrs. Bergrud entered Bishop Pike's bedroom late one night for a book, and he sat up in bed, asleep, and delivered a discourse on the importance of selfishness, of only caring about number one. Gradually, it dawned on them that Jim might be trying to communicate. They finally visited a medium, Mrs. Anna Twigg, in Acton, London, and there discovered that it was, in fact, Jim Pike who had been doing his best to communicate. There were so many personal references and references to matters that could not be known to the medium that it seems reasonable to infer either that she was reading Bishop Pike's mind or that Jim Pike was really present. Halfway through the seance, the theologian Paul Tillich, a friend of Pike's, interrupted to thank him for a dedication to a book. Tillich commented on Jim Pike, quote, "The boy was a visionary born out of due time. He found a society distressing in which sensitivity is classed as weakness." End quote. It seems that Jim Pike was not, at this stage, much changed from the person he had been when alive. His first words were, quote, "I failed the test. I can't face you. Can't face life. I'm confused. Very sudden passing. God, I didn't know what I was doing. But when I got here, I found I wasn't such a failure as I thought. My nervous system failed." End quote. That is to say, the suicide arose from the premature defeat we have been discussing, the conscious mind opting out. Later on, he remarked, quote, "I thought there was a way out. I wanted out. I've found there is no way out. I wish I'd stayed to work out my problems in more familiar surroundings." End quote. There were later seances with other mediums in America, but little of importance was added. The spirit of Jim Pike apparently had precognition, as all spirits have. According to those who know, he was able to tell his father that he would be meeting a certain old friend soon, and that he would shortly be in Virginia. Bishop Pike was convinced this was a mistake until his plane landed at Dulles Airfield, and he remembered that this is on the Virginia side of Washington. But it must be admitted that the rest of the book is anticlimactic. The reader comes up against the usual frustration, that the spirits so seldom say anything important. Perhaps this is because they recognize the human inability to learn from them. Mrs. Bergrud later committed suicide. Oh, okay. Bishop Pike's story does not end there. In August 1969, he and his newly married wife, Diane, went on a trip to the Middle East and became lost in the Israeli wilderness. When he was too exhausted to walk further, his wife went off to try to find help. She found her way back to civilization, but was unable to lead the rescuers back to the cave where she had left her husband. He was later found dead. On September 4, 3 days before his body was located, he quote-unquote communicated with Anna Twigg, the London medium through whom he had first contacted his son. He gave details of what had happened and described where the body was to be found. Diane Pike later wrote in an article, quote, "In that session there were sufficient references that corresponded to the circumstances of our ordeal and that expressed concerns that I knew to be uppermost in Jim's mind at the time of the mishap to enable me to affirm that Jim communicated through Mrs. Twigg." End quote. The same article contains the interesting comment, quote, because she believes everyone is potentially mediumistic, she favors aiming at direct communication through meditation, end quote. It was Professor G. Wilson Knight who revived my own interest in the subject of spiritualism. Consequently, it was natural that I should ask him to explain how he came to be convinced of human survival of death. The accounts he has sent me of communications from his mother, his brother, W.F. Jackson Knight, and John Cowper Powys are circumstantial and impressive. I found his descriptions of communication from Jackson Knight particularly convincing. I had met J.K., as he was generally known, several times between 1960 and his death in 1964. He was the sort of person it would be hard to forget. Very much a personality, quote unquote. Bubbling with genial nervous energy. Wilson Knight describes his manner accurately. Quote, in excited talk and repetition, in fun, in exaggerated protestations of gratitude and praise, and still more in subtle turns of half-comic thought impossible to define, end quote. This brings back to me my first meeting with J.K., the warm, nervous, jerky hand clasp, the rather high, precise voice saying enthusiastically, quote, oh my, how very kind of you to come. How very flattering for me, too. Well, I really didn't imagine, end quote. And so on, until I thought he was pulling my leg. But he wasn't. It was his natural manner. So that when I read in Wilson Knight's manuscript the following transcription, taken down for him by Miss K. Neal in shorthand at an Exeter circle in March 1965, 4 months after J.K.'s death, I could instantly hear J.K.'s voice saying the words. So we have a lengthy quote here, a little over half a page. Quote, how wonderful. Here I am talking to you and supposed to be dead. How very exciting. I have been once or twice but wasn't able to get through. Fifi, a spirit guide, has been so good in helping me, telling me what to do, but I'm not very good at it. Never mind. I shall learn. But it is all so true, so very true. I hardly believed it would be so, but it is so lovely. First going off, I was so excited and to make myself felt just to let you know I was there. Sorry, I cannot make Dick Wilson Knight, somebody he put it in quotes, feel me more, but there, never mind. I shall in time. I shall learn. How wonderful, how exciting. I have been and tried. It is rather difficult, more difficult than what I anticipated, but nevertheless, under Fifi's directions, I shall be able to get on better. Give Dick my love. Tell him I like the arrangements. Sorry I was not able to finish up. He will get them done. He is wonderful, much better than I was at organizing. I had rather an untidy mind. He has a very tidy mind. A very, very wonderful experience for me to be able to come and talk in this room, where I used to come and talk to others. Now I am talking to you. End quote. All right. I believe it's going to be... Ew. Okay. I'm on page 485, and I'm going to go to 508. That'll be my stopping point. All right. So, getting back to it. Sorry about that. For anyone who knew him, this could be no one else than J.K. The self-deprecating humor, the tendency to expostulation. Wilson Knight was himself present at a seance a month later when J.K. was the first to speak through the medium, Dorothy Perkins. He writes, another lengthy quote here, "He started talking to me volubly. 'Thank you so much,' was repeated emphatically, then breaking off suddenly and most characteristically. 'Oh, I'm so sorry. I should be greeting everybody.' Then to me, 'Fifi has given me permission to speak first. How very kind of her. It really is a wonderful experience.' Asked what his life was like now, he replied with words recalling those of T.S. Eliot's spirit seer in Little Gidding. 'Between two worlds become much like each other. Not a lot different, except that things are more beautiful than perhaps they were. Flowers, trees, animal life, very lovely, and there's no pain, no ugliness,' he added. 'If I wish I can see the dark places, I'm not quite ready yet. I would be interested. The hell of people's own making.' Swedenborg, and this is in parentheses, Swedenborg had also described this aspect of the spirit world in some detail, end parentheses. And later, all that we were told is absolutely true. It's so important that everybody should know. It would make people so much happier and more careful. He said that it was not easy to influence people when you see what has to be done to get through to Earth, all the mechanism." End that long quote. Okay. And it looks like we have another one coming up in about a page. "I must admit that I find the flavor of J.K.'s remarks more convincing than any purely factual evidence, which Wilson Knight is also able to offer in abundance. In 1965, a message from J.K. was relayed through Vera Broom of Dawlish at the Exeter Church. He wanted Wilson Knight to give something he greatly valued to his godson, Peter Fletcher, but had difficulty getting his meaning across. Wilson Knight goes on, quote, "Picture language was used. The medium saw a top drawer with a key and was told that there was in it a small object in a leather case. Thinking of metals, I asked if it was military. 'In a way,' came the answer. 'There was no such drawer in our house, but there was on the top of a narrow cupboard a small case with a key, about the width of the cupboard. This might have looked like a top drawer. It contained a few unimportant objects, but with them was a small leather case, and in it a longish pin with thistle decorations, made to imitate a dirk or dagger.' Wilson Knight occasionally engages in spirit writing, which purports to come from either his mother or his brother. On November 14, 1965, he used it to inquire about the pin and was told, quote, 'It was a military symbol meaning the regiment's persisting life, and it was given to me by the colonel of my regiment in 1918, end quote. Wilson Knight adds, quote, 'I do not regard my spirit writing as authoritative on matters of factual detail, though in other things I have found it valuable. But I regard the main message as wholly convincing. J.K.'s friends and godsons meant very much to him. He loved giving them presents, and his Army and OTC experiences were probably the greatest passion of his life. Whatever the story of this pin may have been, my brother's anxious injunction bore every sign of his personality." End quote. It was forwarded as requested. And now a quote followed by a lengthy quote. "I now offer an example that does not concern myself," Wilson Knight writes. So that was the quote. And now this lengthy passage. Quote, "For this I rely on a detailed report made for me by Professor Bonamy Dobray of Leeds University. On 7 June 1952, I invited some of the university staff to accompany me to a demonstration by a famous visiting medium. Mr. Gordon Higginson. There was a large audience, perhaps 1,000. One whom I shall call Mr. A was told correctly his Leeds house number and road name, and was asked if the name of his neighbor was B, B being new to the neighborhood. A was not sure. Two Christian names were given, C for the Mr. B, and D.E., two female names, presumably for his wife. Of these names, A knew nothing. D.E. was said to have had a conversation that morning, and there was a message for her. After the meeting, A made enquiries next door. The surname and both Christian names were correct. A number that had been given turned out to be the number of a house which B had recently left and where he still kept his car. Both Mr. and Mrs. B, however, at first denied any conversation by D.E., as she had been alone all morning, but soon after they returned to say that there had indeed been a conversation over the telephone, and B said, "Please tell us what the message was, because the conversation was about something important, indeed about the most important thing we have ever done in our lives." Unfortunately, A had been so shattered by the identifications that he could not recall the message. A was, as it happened, a laboratory assistant at the university, though not of our party. I don't know what that means. He must have been Professor Dobray. He must have seen Professor Dobray there, because he visited him in a state of considerable disturbance to tell him what had happened. I then asked Professor Dobray to make out for me an exact transcript from which I have drawn in this account of all. Wow. I then asked Professor Dobray to make out for me an exact transcript from which I have drawn in this account of all that he remembered of Gordon Higginson's rapid-fire questions and the subsequent ratifications. End that quote. Such accounts as these may not be spectacular, concerning as they do mainly small details, but then taken together they constitute an overwhelming argument for human survival of bodily death. Wilson Knight remarks, quote, "No theories of the unconscious mind can explain such messages," end quote, and this is surely true. In the above case, the Society for Psychical Research would have obtained signed statements from everybody involved and regarded the case as proven, and it is hard to see how the most hostile skeptic could fault this procedure, short of suggesting mass collusion between the medium, the laboratory assistant, the next-door neighbors, the professor and Professor Dobray, and Wilson Knight. But then cases like this one turn up with such frequency in the records of the SPR that it is surely more logical to accept the phenomena as genuine. Whether or not we are prepared to attach any great importance to it, the case for survival must be regarded as conclusively proven. I shall leave a discussion of its ultimate importance to the final pages of this book. On this topic, Wilson Knight himself concedes, quote, "Having had enough evidence to convince me that helping powers are near, I am not nowadays over-anxious for messages. My main interest is probably in trance addresses by a spirit personality speaking through a medium in trance. The best of these bear external impress of their authority. In use and harmonization of vocal tone, physical poise, gesture, and syntax, they rival and perhaps surpass our leading exponents of church or stage." End quote. After the death of his mother Caroline in 1950, J.K. received messages from her via a South African medium, Margaret Lloyd. J.K. was in South Africa at this time. Later, Wilson Knight visited a medium in London when Carol Knight came through, quote unquote. He reports, quote, I had nursed her during her last weeks, and now she was transmitting messages in detailed and intimate terms about her death and much else that concerned her family." End quote. One of the African messages had mentioned a silver cup with a history, which J.K. thought he could identify. Before he was executed, Charles I took his last communion from the hands of Archbishop Juxon, and 2 gold or silver cups were used. There was a tradition in Wilson Knight's family that these cups had passed to certain ancestors in Jamaica, and Carol Knight was said to have been christened from one of them. Wilson Knight engaged a researcher, R.S. Foreman, to see if he could find any reference to the cups in family documents, but no mention of them could be found in various wills. It began to look as if the cups were a myth, but Caroline Knight continued to insist through mediums that they really existed. In April 1951, Wilson Knight attended a service at which Mrs. Nella Taylor was the medium. She singled him out, and told him that she could see a figure with a red hood, an Oxford hood, holding out a roll of parchments towards him. He assumed this was a will. A few days later, he received an excited letter from his researcher. A will had been found that proved the existence of the cups, quote, "which formerly belonged to Archbishop Juxon." End quote. They had been left to an ancestor of the Knights, Samuel Jackson, who, oddly enough, had been at Oxford. The figure with the red hood had appeared when news of the will was leaving Jamaica for London. Quote, "Perhaps the most striking of all my experiences," writes Wilson Knight, "came when I thought I was being advised through Mrs. Gwen Jones at the Exeter Church not to the 1952 lecture. This I could understand. Confusion was my own fault. The message only referred to going abroad, and I had forgotten that I was also dallying with the offer to keep up a permanent appointment in drama at the University of California. Still anxious, I attended a circle in Exeter. With some difficulty and a sense of great strain and urgency, my mother herself controlled the medium, quote unquote, Dorothy Perkins. She had only once done this before, saying very slowly, 'I want you to go to South Africa, not to America. Get the house settled first.' All was then clear. My brother and I were buying a house, and I would have been most unwise to take up the California appointment. Was the sense of urgency on an important family issue, causing my mother to labor hard to put things right." End quote. Wilson Knight knew John Cowper Poise well. In a preface to the 1960 edition of Wolf Solent, Powes wrote, quote, "Whatever death may mean, and none of us really know, I have come to the conclusion for myself that when I die, it is the complete and absolute end of me." End quote. He died on June 17th, 1963, aged 90. 1 month later, Miss Frances Horsfield, a medium of Bideford, Devon, addressed Wilson Knight during a demonstration in the Exeter Church. A man was standing by him. Quote, He has a rather gaunt features with high cheekbones and unruly hair. He is a personality. I find it difficult to get close to him. He is nearly controlling me, i.e. speaking through her. But I do not want that. He was himself an occultist and knew as much as anyone about the continuity of life. He wrote, didn't he? He wrote, didn't he? End quote. Wilson Knight said yes. Mrs. Horsfield then asked, quote, "Can I go to Wales?" End quote, confirming his suspicion that it was Powys, or Poise. P-O-W-Y-S. I'm not sure how you would pronounce that. The medium went on, quote, "He is so close to you, it's a wonder you can't sense him yourself. His power is so strong that you may well see him yourself sometime. He has a lovely smile and a wide, gleaming mouth. He is thanking you for what you did for him, and in return he wants to help you." End quote. Afterwards, the medium added that Powys had a beak-like nose. She had not herself read any of Powell's books, but she repeated that his power was greater than any she had experienced. When Wilson Knight told her that Powell had often discussed life after death in his books, but had become skeptical towards the end, she commented, quote, "Anyway, he knows all about it now," end quote. Later, Jackson Knight received a message from Powell's via the same medium, which he sent to Wilson, evidential cross-reference, filled sensualism for you to explain, end quote. Readers of Powell's will know that sensuality is a key word in all his work. One of his best philosophical books is called In Defense of Sensuality. The word carries mystical overtones. It's, quote, "In some letters to me of January or February 1957, Powell's had emphasized the importance of masturbation as a way to the mastery of dangerous impulse, and he had urged me to act as a, quote unquote, a kind of missionary in this cause. When I last saw him in 1963, he was weak and hardly spoke at all, but instead used an emphatic sign language of knotted hands, which I took to hold a sexual reference. Perhaps it was a final injunction to me to stand on the masturbatory doctrine. It is Powell's second message through Miss Horsfield had a more than evidential purpose and was intended to remind me about the doctrine," end quote. It must be frankly acknowledged that the objection that many intelligent people feel towards spiritualism is less a doubt about the validity of its evidence than about the way it seems to simplify the universe. The worst thing about human life is the way that human beings remain stuck in the quote-unquote triviality of everydayness, the way they accept the limitations of their narrow consciousness. Plato points out that the philosopher and the poet spend their lives trying to escape the limitations of the body, aware that consciousness can't take this. William James's distant horizons of fact, but not sure how to wiggle out of the trap in which we all seem to be caught. Poets, philosophers, and saints are centrally concerned with escaping this trap, which Christians call original sin. Perhaps the skeptic's central objection to spiritualism could be expressed like this, that after Dante's comedy, the visions of St. John of the Cross and William Blake, Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, the paintings of Van Gogh, there is something anticlimactic about the messages that come through at spiritualist meetings. But it would be a mistake to make too much of this point. After all, messages from the dead to the living are bound to be concerned mainly with everyday affairs. We might also bear in mind that the young couple in Bonamy Dobray's script said that the message concerned the most important action of their lives. And spirit teachings, whether in Swedenborg, Stanton Moses, or a modern exponent like Maurice Barbanel, bear a stamp of healthy-minded authenticity. If the evidence was unassailable, a universal acceptance of life after death could only have a beneficial effect on our civilization. We might at this point take note of an odd fact recorded by Wilson Knight in an article written in 1960. Quote, "Physical mediums are now more scarce than in the past. The great ones of the last century are looked back on as classics, and it may well be that other kinds of phenomena will grow rarer." End quote. It is a matter for regret that now, when we have elaborate apparatus for testing the claims of mediums like Hume and Eusapia Palladino, such powers should be dying out. This is a matter to which I must return in the concluding pages of this book. Wilson Knight ends his article on spiritualism, quote, It is not to be supposed that spiritualism can replace our set disciplines, but rather that it is in different ways basic to all. Sources must be tapped through deeper levels which owe nothing to our own minds." End quote. And this suggests at least a partial answer to the question raised in the last paragraph. In a case like Hume, the hidden powers lay at the red end of the spectrum, and this is no doubt why many intelligent men like Hawthorne thought them interesting but irrelevant. The powers Gurdjieff was striving to develop lay at the violet end. Hume was like an iceberg. Most of his being lay in the realm of the subconscious. Gurdjieff aimed at an extension of the consciousness, an attempt to develop a strength of the mind equivalent to an athlete's strength of body. Inevitably, he acquired quote-unquote infrared powers. At the same time, for if the tree is to grow higher, its roots must also go deeper. Could it be that mediums are becoming scarcer because at this point in human evolution, ultraviolet powers are more important than infrared? This raises another central point. Christian Science is in agreement with occult tradition in regarding the subconscious powers as a source of health. The simplest and perhaps crudest statement of this notion is expressed in the work of D.H. Lawrence. If man becomes too intellectual, says Lawrence, he destroys his deeper powers, breaks his contract with the realm of instinct, which is also the realm of enriched vitality. All that Lady Chatterley needs to rescue her from her devitalized existence is to return to the deep, dark realm of sex. But Lawrence's own work reveals the fallacy behind this notion. At the end of his novels, the reader wants to ask, what do the characters do now? Gurdjieff would have had no trouble in pinpointing the fallacy. He is concerned with people whose centers are out of harmony, whose sexual center tries to work with emotional energy, and so on. Lawrence would advise such dislocated people to go back to nature, to their primitive origins. They do, and the instinctive and sexual centers begin to work with their own energy. What now? Now Gurdjieff would say the serious work can begin. But this is precisely the point where Lawrence stops. The subconscious powers are not the source of health, not on their own. Otherwise, Lawrence would not have died of tuberculosis at 45. And Sri Ramakrishna, who could plunge into samadhi a dozen times a day, would not have died of a cancer of the throat. Paracelsus knew better that the source of health is the evolutionary drive, whose major instrument is imagination, faculty X. Life that marks time, whether on the highest intellectual or the lowest instinctive level, is in danger of stagnation. Occult powers on their own are no more desirable than the power to do enormous sums in mental arithmetic. Aldous Huxley remarks in a letter to J.B. Rhine, December 30th, 1942, quote, "The mystics have been unanimous in warning aspirants to the knowledge of God to have nothing to do with the psychic powers which they are likely to develop while pursuing the path of contemplation. For such powers and the quote-unquote miracles which they allow their owners to perform have no more to do with divine reality than the more familiar kinds of psychophysical phenomena." End quote. And in the same letter, Huxley makes the vitally important point that all occult powers stem from the human mind itself, not from gods or demons or spirits. Quote, "This means that any religion, if intensely enough believed in, creates the object of its worships, gods, defunct saints, and the like. These objectifications or projections may become centers of energy reinforcing the energies of individual prayers, desires, and imaginations, and thus may assist the worshipper in getting the result he desires. Thus, in the Tibetan Book of the Dead are to be found the most categorical statements to the effect that the tutelary deities of the worshipper and even the high Buddhas themselves are objectifications projected by human minds and ultimately unreal. The final independent reality is the clear light of the void." End quote. According to this view, even the Christian Scientist notion of God is the source of health, that God is the source of health, is a misunderstanding. The source lies in the worshiper's own mind. I've heard that theory before, just as an aside. I've heard it before, how that's why certain um, cults never got beyond the level of cult, is because they didn't have enough adherents. There wasn't enough power in the beliefs, because the more adherents there were, the more power there was in the beliefs, whether the belief was in something real or not. I'm not saying I agree with that. I'm just saying that was the theory. That like Mithraism is or was a cult that came around a little bit before Jesus, so a little bit before the 0 year, and persisted after Jesus for a while, and it has a lot of overlap, like Immaculate Conception and this one's not a true overlap, but it's considered an overlap, being born at the winter solstice, some quite a few different dying and being resurrected 3 days later, that sort of thing. All of those things are parallels between Mithraism and Christianity, but Mithraism died out partly because of actions, to actively stomp it out, but also because it just didn't have enough adherents to give the beliefs the power to continue, if that makes any sense. Anyway, enough of that. Moving on. And so we reach the paradoxical conclusion that the apparitions of the dead that speak through mediums are already in the mind of the medium, and yet are objective realities. It would be a mistake to draw a distinction between Hume's own powers and the power of spirits operating through him. They are one and the same. In 1882, 10 years after Hume's retirement, W. F. Barrett, F. W. H. Myers, and Henry Sidgwick founded the Society for Psychical Research, and a brilliant young intellectual, Edmund Gurney, became one of its leading lights. The date should have marked a turning point in the history of occultism, since it meant that solid, skeptical Englishmen with a scientific turn of mind would now investigate a subject whose advocates had so far been cranks, or at least romantics. The results were disappointing. Gurney committed suicide in a Brighton hotel in 1888, when he discovered that certain trusted mediums were tricksters, and although the SPR has had many eminent adherents, from Sir William Crookes, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, and Sir Oliver Lodge, down to Professors C.D. Broad and Wilson Knight, it has failed to make any general impact. The Reverend Stainton Moses, a remarkable psychic who developed his powers by conscious effort, left the society in 1886 because he felt it was too cold and scientific. For him, spiritualism was a religion. But the general public was not interested in spiritualism as a science or religion. This is as true today as it was in 1882, and the reason, almost certainly, is the one we have already discussed, that there is something oddly uninspiring about these accounts of messages from the dead, apparitions of the living, and so on, like a cold Methodist Sunday school on a wet afternoon. There is a failure, for example, to note the sexual origin of some of the phenomena. One of the most notable of the mediums after Hume, Eusapia Palladino, never made any secret about her strong erotic tendencies. When W. F. Monk, M-O-N-C-K, was exposed as a fraudulent medium in 1876, obscene letters were found in his luggage. They were from women with whom he had been carrying on intrigues in the darkness of the séance room. Myers himself had a reputation as a would-be Don Juan, and it was undoubtedly some odd sexual obsession that made him insist on accompanying Gurney on his honeymoon to Switzerland, in spite of Mrs. Gurney's protests. Houdini, who investigated many mediums for fraud, disclosed that they often offered payment in kind for his collusion. The late Negley Farson told me of an interview during which Houdini inside Nick. Trevor pointed out that Myers was a character at Cambridge about Myers's theft of 25 lines from someone else's poem in an effort he claimed to be his own, and a fellow student described returning unexpectedly to his room and finding Myers reading his letters. I am not asserting that all this proves anything against spiritualism. It doesn't. Eusapia Pallas undoubtedly, yet she was exposed for a kind of genial dishonesty seemed to be part of her character, as of Madame Blavatsky's. At her early seances, spectators were enraged when the spirits relieved them of their wallets and watches. Eusapia was often firmly tied to a chair when this happened, but her subconscious desires clearly affected the spirits. Myers's dubious character in matters of sex or other people's correspondence does not prove that he would be capable of faking the results of a seance, but it should be taken into account that his motives in forming the SPR may have been highly charged and emotional rather than purely scientific. No one would suspect that this in reading the carefully objective publications of these early members of the SPR. Myers's human personality and its survival of bodily death, Phantasms of the Living by Myers, Gurney, and Podmore, Apparitions by G.N.M. Tyrrell, or even C.D. Broad's Lectures on Psychical Research, 1962. All this has tended to present a picture of spiritualism as a harmless branch of Christianity, when in fact it is more closely related to the witchcraft of the Reformation or the Dionysian religion of ancient Greece. Perhaps if this was more generally recognized by spiritualists themselves as well as by the general public, the result might be a more widespread interest in the movement, as well as a deeper understanding of the forces involved. In the case of the SPR, the sober public image may be explained by the following comment from Harry Price. Quote, "The late Sir William Barrett, the founder, once wrote me that he was treated like a child at the council meetings, and that Mrs. Sedgwick always gets her own way, which I could quite believe. The feminine element was always a factor at the SPR, as in most psychic societies." End quote. Price, who made his name as a highly skeptical investigator of psychic matters, was himself the subject of a vigorous debunking by the SPR after his death. The case is worth citing as an example of the virtues and limitations of the skeptical approach to the occult. In June 1929, a London newspaper carried an article about alleged hauntings at a rectory near Sudbury in Essex. Harry Price, an eminent member of the SPR, decided to investigate. In 1940, Price published a book about Borley Rectory called The Most Haunted House in England, calling it, quote, "the best authenticated case of haunting in the annals of psychical research," end quote. The book caused a sensation. In 1956, not long after Price's death, the SPR published a book called The Haunting of Borley Rectory, E.G. Hall, Kathleen Goldney, and Trevor Hall, whose main purpose was to discredit Price. Price had made a name for his investigation into fraudulent mediums. The strange legends about Borley date from long before Price heard of the place. It had been built in 1863 by a clergyman named Bull, and his son had lived there after his death. Bull Jr. was interested in psychical research. When Price investigated the house in 1929, the tenant was the Reverend G.E. Smith and his wife, who left not long after. A couple named Foister moved in. The wife, Mary Ann, was much younger than her husband. She was 31. Poltergeist phenomena now began to occur in earnest. Mrs. Foister was struck and thrown out of bed. Objects flew around. A child's footsteps were heard. Messages addressed to MF were found scrawled on walls. Bells rang, raps sounded, doors were locked, furniture overturned. Price was inclined to suspect Marianne's honesty in connection with some of these occurrences. At all events, the Foisters moved out in 1935. In 1937, Price rented the rectory and moved back with a team of investigators, but very little occurred. It was burnt in the Price says saw a shed like the sealed room was smashed through. The various stories seem to use into spiritual often, and his daughter confirmed her to Colin to find a strange man standing beside her bed and had felt someone sitting down on the bed on one or two occasions. She also saw the nun several years later appeared longer than in 19 itself, probably produced some of hell that whizzed across that even present often headlamps in the darkness outside. Her husband went through the files of letters to Price. Borley the to attempt to go many of the hauntings as can be discredited to advance of Price and Marianne Foister, but all their natural explanations cannot of being a Price. The Smiths time Price investigated occurred when the Foisters were there, and Price took trouble to rent the house and investigate in 1937. He appeared investigating doing it. None of his team had any suspicion of him. The genuine phenomena, those of Willie Schneider, who described by Thomas Mann in Occult. Why should he take so much trouble with worthless legend on a slender foundation? While a sense of drama and desire to convince led him to exaggerate, to believing that he acted. Another thing reported by R.J. Hastings and the same rather uncharitable attitude to Price is shown in another book by Dingwall and Hall, Four Modern Ghosts, which examines Price's account of a seance at which a little girl named Rosalie materialized. Price's story in 50 Years of Psychic Research is that a broadcast about Borley Rector in 1937, a lady rang him up and invited him to a seance where Rosalie was expected to materialize. One condition was that Price should not publicly ask the house by which the people could be identified. In South London, met the mother. Not long after the seance began, Price was allowed to make a child about 6. The seance was over. Price was still in the ruin. Next morning, Mrs. Kathleen Goldney, one of the exposure of Borley Price, and found him haggard and hot. She told her about his had a slight story. Price story, which he had wrote the account in his book. Stories that have materialized to Rosalie died when Price died. Article Mrs. Goldney really saw Price looking badly shaken the morning for the Rosalie experience, but go on to explain why they disbelieved the story. Price described the house in some detail while not revealing when it was found. In the letter he had apparently mentioned it as being at Brockley. The authors therefore got hold of an ordnance survey map of Brockley and ascertained that no house there fitted Price. At least there was one in 1937, and Price that the Rosalie's been going on since 1929. Price himself had lived in Brockley as a child, and even in the house. And heard that Price seen the house when he lived in Brockley and used its description in Goldney, who worked closely with Price for many years, remarked during the Borley investigation, quote, "Though I credited Price with intellectual dishonesty, I had not imagined he would ever stoop to fraudulent actions, end quote. Mrs. who had also known Price since 1922, was equally convinced that Price would do anything for publicity. He sent some tribute to Mr. This scathing book for modern ghosts, which makes it quite clear that he disliked Price. So the unbiased this is Dingwall but it does suggest that he soused rather than the detached. He concludes, never, in my opinion, advanced our knowledge of the supernormal. So precisely the same thing can be said of Mr. Dingwall. His attacks on Price did not even advance. Morley could have been a series of questions. If we were willing to examine nothing, we would take three old monastery or not paint the bowl, and he even various spirits that doubted his sensitivity, not but a few. But Marianne Foister, a poltergeist, entirely due to her own psyche, the phenomena stopped. Although Man, Myth, and Magic prints a photograph allegedly showing a brick floating in the air at the time when the rectory was being demolished. There is nothing very hard to accept in all this. Apparitions in 1939, the realization of Rosalie. If it was only skeptic, but there is someone can produce a book proving that Price was a pathological liar ready to suspend judgment, and this is back where we started. It should be noted that Dale is in very peculiar, some human oddities, both books, willing to appreciate the flying cartoon things. Oh, I don't look frozen on my screen, but online it looks like I am frozen. An unusually long delay. Okay. This property of it was a period. Rosemary is a London housewife. She is also a hold with an elderly gentleman as a musician. In 1960, that he was the Liz. I don't know how to ZT. Miss played the piano really well. At Liszt's she wrote the new style, and Liszt brought up Hubert, Brahms, and Debussy. It was soon used. Influential people became interested, and a fund was started to allow her to devote full time to her musical activities. The BBC did a program about her, and it was impressive, for it seemed reasonably clear that Mrs. Brown must be receiving the music from somewhere. It was not purely her own invention. Other musical mediums who were played on the program could have been frauds, conspicuously or unconspicuously. Improvisations in the manner of Chopin or Liszt were no better than, say, Victor Borge's imitations of various composers. Mrs. Brown's work was unusually more complex, and one got the impression that she found some of it quite bewildering. The record can allow listeners to judge for themselves. On one side, Mrs. Brown plays Liszt, Grieg, I guess, Grieg, Chopin, and Schumann. On the other, the concert pianist Peter Caton plays pieces from Beethoven, Schubert, Debussy, Chopin, and Brahms, all of them too difficult for Mrs. Brown's modest abilities as a pianist. The spirit of Sir Donald Tovey, the musicologist, dictated a typical introduction to Mrs. Brown on January 1st, 1970. Another long quote. Humanity is now moving into an age of increasing emancipation from many of its past limitations. Technical achievements and medical advances confer growing freedom from various oppressions and ills. Man's greatest problem is still himself and his orientation to his fellow beings. To understand himself fully, he should become aware of the fact that he does not conform a soul which is housed in an immortal body and endowed with a mind that is independent of the physical brain. In communication through musicians, who in the world are attempting to establish a precept for humanity, i.e., that physical death is a transition from one state of consciousness to another wherein one retains one's individuality. The realization of this fact should assist man to a greater insight into his own nature and potential superterrestrial activities. The knowledge that incarnation in your world is but one stage of man's eternal life should far seeing than those frequently adopted at present, and encourage a more balanced outlook regarding all matters." End quote. This is clear enough. The musicians wish to convince humanity that death is not the end. But does the music achieve this effect? That is hard to say. Enos Shoup Jr., a reviewer in the New Records, a magazine issued in Philadelphia, says of the Peter Catton side, quote, "Some of them could be considered practically first quality by the particular composer. None could be considered other than very fine." End quote. Excuse me. Try to imagine Beethoven, Brahms agreeing to compose music in order to convince us that they are still alive. We immediately anticipate something totally convincing, something that startles the listener with its power and audacity, as the opening bars of the Fifth Symphony startled Beethoven's contemporaries. And there is nothing of the sort on this record. In fact, all of it could have been composed by any skilled musician, for example, by Peter Catton himself. But Mrs. Brown is not a skilled musician. She does not even have a gramophone in her house, and so the balance of probability is on her side. The question remains, if the great composers wish to convince us of life after death, why do they not do it by composing a masterpiece? That would be the most overpowering evidence. If the spirits could add one poem or symphony of genius to our present stock, it would make more converts for spiritualism than all the publications of the SPR. Mrs. Brown is apparently taking down Beethoven's 10th Symphony at this moment, so perhaps the spirits have already reached the same conclusion. In the meantime, Mrs. Brown's recorded music will convince those who want to believe and leave the skeptics as incredulous as ever. And at this moment was back in 1971. Keep that in mind. Moving on. In his excellent book, Apparitions, G.N.M. Tyrrell makes a useful distinction between ghosts and crisis apparitions. He cites a typical crisis case. A woman bending over her baby turned around and saw her brother, an airman. He looked perfectly solid and normal. She assumed he had been given leave from France, where he was in the Air Force, this was 1917, and spent a moment putting the baby in a safe position before turning to speak to him, but he had vanished. She was still not convinced that she had seen an apparition. She called out to him, thinking he was hiding for a joke, but he was nowhere to be seen. She then began to feel sick and afraid. It was another 2 weeks before she learned that her brother was missing. A ghost may also feel perfectly lifelike. Most real-life ghost stories concern quite solid-looking ghosts, but they usually behave in a way that indicates that they are hardly aware of the human beings present. Tyrrell speaks of this, quote-unquote, somnambulistic or automatic behavior. The theater critic W. McQueen Pope, in his book Pillars of Drury Lane, describes actually seeing one of the theater's most famous ghosts, quote, the man in gray, end quote, who on one occasion walked out of a wall in the upper circle, walked through the bar, and disappeared through the opposite wall, completely ignoring the people present. He could be seen at the distance of several feet, but vanished at close quarters. reappearing again when he was several feet away from the onlooker. While it would not be entirely true to say that ghosts of this type always ignore people, it does seem that they are not fully conscious of their surroundings. In this case, they bear an odd resemblance to specters of the living. I have already pointed out that Powes did not know that he had appeared to Theodore Dreiser until Dreiser rang him up and told him. Also, the curious and quite inconclusive case of Canon Bourne, who was out hunting with his daughters and a coachman. The daughters decided to return home, and father went on. As they turned to go home, both daughters and the coachman saw Canon Bourne waving to them from the other side of the valley. They hurried to the place where he had been, but found no one there. This story should end with the daughters arriving home and learning that their father had been thrown from his horse and was seriously injured. In fact, he returned home not long after they did, perfectly unharmed, and verified that he had not waved to them and had not met with an accident. What seems to have happened is that, in some unconscious way, he had projected a figure of himself waving to them. There's also a theory about apparitions that don't acknowledge the people witnessing them, that they're actually just somehow recorded memories. They're not people, they're not ghosts, they're not specters, they're just a recorded memory of some kind for some reason. I don't remember whose theory that is. I'm not saying I believe it either, but it is a theory. Anyway, Tyrrell cites a similar case in which someone deliberately tried to appear to two sisters who lived in a house at Kew, K-E-W. The experimenter, presumably a woman, sat by the fire in her room and made an intense effort of concentration, which resulted in a kind of trance, during which she was conscious but could not move. Half an hour later, she threw off the trance with an effort of will. The following day, she visited Kew and discovered that the experiment had been remarkably successful. A lady in the house, but not one of those to whom she was trying to appear, said that she had seen her walking along the passage at 9:30 the previous evening. The time had been she had started making the attempt. She had reappeared in the front bedroom at midnight. Then she had taken the hand of the lady in the bed, who was awake, and stared into her eyes. The odd feature of this second appearance is that the experimenter was asleep in her own bed at that time, although she had determined to appear in the front bedroom of the Kew house at midnight. We are here quite clearly dealing with some form of telepathy, and it is tempting to assume that all crisis apparitions are the result of telepathy between people who are close together, but there are too many well-attested cases of the apparitions appearing to several people for this to be wholly acceptable. Tyrrell cites a case in which a housewife saw an unknown naval officer bending over the end of the bed. She drew her husband's attention to the man, and the husband shouted irritably, quote, "What on earth are you doing here, sir?" end quote, and leapt out of bed. The naval officer then walked off through the wall. The housewife wondered if the apparition portended some danger to her brother, who was in the Navy, but her husband said impatiently, quote, "No," end quote, who had been dead for 14 years. The husband was in financial difficulties, and the apparition, their vital message, the vital states, the physical basis of all psychic belief is a complete duplicate of the body, resembling it in the smallest particular, although constructed of far more tenuous material. In ordinary conditions, these two bodies are intermingled so that the identity of the finer one is entirely obscured. At death, however, and under the course of life, at death, and be seen separately, end quote. This view certainly sounds naive, and must no doubt dismiss it as wishful thinking. But it must be admitted that the more one reads on these matters, the more common-sensible it sounds. Naive or not, evidence supports the view that physical death is not total extinction, as materialists believe. or even a transition to some higher mystical plane that is completely incomprehensible to human beings, a view that is tempting to be to the mystically inclined, but for the time being, at any rate, some kind of continuation of the physical personality. The view expressed satirically by Noel Coward in Blithe's Spirit, where the ghosts behave exactly as though they were human beings, is well supported by the evidence. Sir Ernest Bennett's Apparitions in Haunted Houses, one of the best documented books on the subject, cites a case in which an old chimney sweep, Samuel Bull, died of sooty cancer, leaving behind a bedridden widow in the charge of his daughter and son-in-law. There were 5 children in the house, as well as a 21-year-old grandson. The family were living in overcrowded and unhappy conditions in a condemned cottage, and no doubt the widow experienced considerable distress. About 9 months later, the children became nervous and restless. They were unable to sleep because they said someone was outside the door. Then one evening, the ghost of the chimney sweep walked up the stairs and through the door of the room in which he had died, and in which his widow now lay. On the first occasion this happened, the grandchildren were terrified, but as it continued over 2 months, they began to get used to it and took it calmly. The apparition would stand by Mrs. Bull's bed with his hand on her forehead. She said it felt firm but cold. These visits were not brief. One lasted more than an hour, and everyone in the family saw them. The SPR was notified only a short time before the family was rehoused in April 1932, when the appearances had ceased, but the signed statement and long interviews with members of the family make it unlikely that this was a plot to gain publicity. The ghost seems to have appeared because he was worried about his wife and the generally unhappy condition of the family. He usually looked sad, but on his last 2 appearances seemed much more cheerful. By this time, the family expected to move to a better house. Under the circumstances, it would obviously be of interest if the spirits would take the trouble to explain exactly what does happen after death and how long they are kept hanging around in an earthbound condition. Perhaps Bishop Pike's son, Jim, began by explaining, quote, "I am not in purgatory, but something like hell here," end quote, and added that nobody blamed him. It might seem that only confused spirits find themselves in Jim Pike's limbo, but since Bishop Pike alleges that Paul Tillich also communicated, this cannot be maintained. Swedenborg explains that in the afterlife, spirits progress and evolve just as they do on earth, and that hell must be understood as a mental condition of confused and self-tormenting spirits. This sounds immediately plausible, but Swedenborg's extraordinary comments on the inhabitants of the moon lead one to suspect his reliability as a witness of the other world. Conan Doyle's descriptions of the other side makes it sound like an idealized version of this one. Quote, "They are very busy on all forms of congenial work. The world in which they find themselves is very much like that which they have quitted, but everything keyed to a higher octave." The word octave is interesting in this connection. Gurdjieff asserts that the universe is based on a principle of octaves. As in a higher octave, the rhythm is the same and the relation of notes to each other the same, but the total effect different. So it is here, end quote. So there was a kind of an insert. Maybe I should have said that. Anyway, children grow up, but there is no aging apart from this, and there is, quote-unquote, close union between the sexes, but no physical side to love. Jim Pike explained, quote, "Yes, there is sex, but it is not like it is there. It is not physical, of course, but actually there is less limitation. Here you can actually enter the whole person," end quote. We may consider all this absurd, but then the whole subject of the occult is full of absurdities that offend the logical mind and yet cannot be dismissed as fantasies. Our position in the world is absurd. Life seems solid and real enough, but the moment we try to pursue any problem beyond a certain limit, it vanishes into a misty realm of ambiguities. We are enmeshed in dreams and illusions, and the strongest characteristic of the human race is stupidity and short-sightedness. And when we study some of these messages from the spirit world, there seems to be good reason for skepticism. G.K. Chesterton devotes several excellent pages of his autobiography to spiritualism, and they have a ring of cheerful sanity that carries conviction. He agrees that in seances, quote, something happens which is not in the ordinary sense natural or produced by the normal and conscious human will, whether it is produced by some subconscious but still human force or by some powers, good, bad, or indifferent, which are external to humanity, I would not myself attempt to decide. The only thing I will say with complete confidence about that mystic and invisible power is that it tells lies, end quote. He then tells some hilarious stories of his own experiments with a planchette, an apparatus for automatic writing. Asked what advice it would give a very dull member of Parliament to the group promptly get divorced, since the wife was equally dull and respectable, whereupon the planchette wrote at great speed and in one word, life. I guess that's supposed to be in colloquial. Anyway, Chesterton Sr. tried testing the spirit by and the board answered pointed that this applied before. He asked, and the board replied promptly, Cardinal Manning. But when we have reached the point of Chesterton that belief in mediums and moonshine are feeble-mindedness, mediums and moonshine is in quotes, are probably a sign of feeble-mindedness, we then have to recognize that the standpoint from which he is criticizing them is that of Orthodox Catholicism, which insists on the infallibility of the Pope and the reality of the devil, and that Chesterton's air of strong-minded sanity is not to be trusted. The only thing that emerges with any certainty from the study of spiritualism and occultism is that our normal, sane, balanced standpoint is built upon quicksand, since it is based upon a common-sense view of human consciousness that does not correspond to the facts. Perhaps the only valid criticism of spiritualism is that it would be better to learn to grasp the facts of human consciousness before we concern ourselves with the facts about the other world. Okay. All right. A few more pages. And this, yeah, hold on. Sorry. I just had a sudden thought. Okay. Actually, no, I am going to continue to page 508. All right. And this brings again to for if not all of these undoubtedly human in or are undoubtedly human in origin. The, quote, phantom drummer of Tedworth, end quote, one of the most celebrated of all poltergeists, was not a phantom but a living man. The drummer was a vagabond named William Drury, who in March 1661 was making a nuisance of himself at the small town of in Wiltshire. A magistrate from nearby Tedworth, Mr. John told that the drummer was trying to blackmail local money to stop his racket, and he had Drury arrested. Drury's pass, authorizing him to beg in that part of the world, proved to be counterfeit. Mr. Mompesson had the drum confiscated and the beggars sent to jail. The drum was sent to Mr. Mompesson's house, and thereupon an incredible series of poltergeist phenomena commenced. There were tremendous bangs and thumps on doors and walls. The disturbances would conclude with a tattoo beat on the drum. All the poltergeists began terror children, beating tattoos on their bed, lifting them up into the air, shaking them, and making sinister scratching noises under the bed. Mr. Mompesson had them removed to a neighbor's house for peace. The spirit attacked the blacksmith with a pair of pincers, snatched a sword from a guest and wrestled for it when he tried to take it back, and grabbed a large stick from a servant woman who was trying to bar its path. The Reverend investigated the case and wrote about it, scratching noises on the children's bed, and his hoarse terror when he went down to it the next morning. He died shortly after. Communication with the spirit, asking it to knock 3 times if Drury lay behind the disturbances. 3 clear knocks sounded. Although the drummer was acquitted on the charge of forging a false warrant for lack of evidence, he was transported for stealing a pig, whereupon the disturbances ceased. I'm not sure what they mean by transported. Put in prison, I'm sure, but transporting, sent him to Australia. They were using as a penal colony, I think, around 1661. I'm not sure. Is that too far back? I don't know. Anyway, it would be pointless to ask how Drury caused it he did. Probably he didn't know himself. Power had something in common with Hume's strange knack of making furniture float, and something in common with Pows's astral projection. That much is apparent. It is also safe to say that we all possess the power, at least potentially. It seems to be stronger, or at least closer to the surface, in children than in adults, but it is not true, as some writers have stated, that children are always involved in poltergeist disturbances. It is impossible to doubt they are caused by, quote, monsters of the subconscious. That case makes this clear. In The Personality of Man, Tyrrell describes the case of a neurotic child, a girl of 14, who is going through the usual tensions of puberty when spectacular but unexplainable. When she was and clicking sounds and noises occurred in other parts of the room that had no obvious cause. In Poltergeists, a book, describes a female child where disturbances occurred, but no matter how loud the bangs and raps became, she slept on. In this case, he investigated. A mother and daughter lived alone in a house in southern England while the father was absent. Both were bored. The mother often went out in the evening, leaving the child alone. Then the disturbances began, plates flying about, doors banging, raps and crashes all over the house. The mother stopped going out, and the disturbances ceased. The child was not counterfeiting the disturbances. They were genuine enough, but her subconscious mind was making sure that her mother stayed home. But beyond this, it is difficult to generalize about poltergeist phenomena. There have been cases in which a house has remained haunted by a poltergeist throughout a number of tenancies, and others where the poltergeist has been active for many years. The Willington Mill poltergeist, cited by Sitwell, displayed enormous inventiveness over 12 years, showing itself as an apparition of a monkey, a cat, a veiled woman, or a heavy-footed man, and produced every conceivable kind of noise, from whistles and bangs to guttural remarks and the sound of machinery. In most cases, the disturbances are not of long duration, perhaps a month or so. An article, 4 Months in a Haunted House, in Harper's Magazine, 1962, describes a typical case of poltergeist activity in a house in Cape Cod. Thumps, bangs, rappings on walls. In one unusual feature is a noise its one unusual feature is a noise that the author, who uses the pen named Harlan Jacobs, describes as the grand piano smash, which sounded as if a grand piano had been dropped on the floor. It shook the house. They were in the garage from which the sound had come, 3 seconds after the crash, and found everything undisturbed. They heard the crash on 2 more occasions. The 4th time it happened, it was heard only by 3 visitors sleeping in the bedroom normally occupied by the author's wife. They heard it and described it as shaking the house, but the author and his wife, sleeping in another part of the small house, didn't hear a thing. It is this aspect of ghost phenomena that leads Tyrrell, in common with Myers and Gurney, to theorize that some of the sights and sounds may be purely mental, a kind of telepathy, and that when they are heard or seen by a number of people, it is a case of telepathic intercommunication between the witnesses. About 2 more pages to go. The energies that produce these disturbances may or may not be those known to psychics. In The Night Side of Nature, 1849, Mrs. Catherine Crowe describes the case of Angelique Cotton, a 14-year-old French girl, lots of 14-year-old girls all of a sudden, 14-year-old French girl who was weaving silk at an oak frame in January 1846 when the frame began to plunge about. The other girls all retreated to the other side of the room, then returned one by one. The frame remained still until Angelique returned, then began to jerk violently again. Her family assumed it to be a devil and tried to have her exorcised, but the priest was inclined to believe it to be a physical phenomena. He was probably right. The disturbances became less violent if she was standing on a carpet or waxed cloth, and her quote-unquote field of force did not affect metal. But organic objects, even a heavy stone trough, what? Quote-unquote organic objects, anyway, even a heavy stone trough, would rear like a frightened horse if her apron touched them. When she was tired, the effects diminished. Wilhelm Reich, of whom I shall speak in the next chapter, would undoubtedly attribute the phenomena to orgone energy, a form of universal energy known to physics. It must be admitted that it is hard to explain the forces produced by Angelique on any other hypothesis. The disturbances went on from mid-January until April, and then gradually died away. They were widely investigated at the time. Mrs. Crowe mentions a number of other similar instances and adds the curious statement, quote, many somnambulistic persons are capable of giving an electric shock, and I have met with one person, not somnambulistic, who informs me that he has frequently been able to do it by an effort of will, end quote. She goes on to describe the case of Mademoiselle Emmerich, sister of the professor at Strasbourg, who became electrified as a result of a bad shock, which made her a sleepwalker, and whose body, quote, became so surcharged with electricity that it was necessary for her relief to discharge it, and she was imparting a complete battery of shocks to her brother and her physician, and whoever was her, end quote. She apparently developed some degree of power of the electric eel, which is still a mystery to science. The electric eel can produce as much as 600 volts. Its bursts of electricity are extremely rapid, like machine gun fire, and can be sprayed out at the rate of 3,000 a second. It seems probable that the spontaneous combustion, Corians, quote spontaneous combustion, so much was related to this same curious energy. Since the nature of static electricity has been understood, it has ceased to provoke the same interest, but continue to occur, and they cannot alter electricity, at least not the kind normally produced by dry hair or silk clothes, by Emil Schirmacher. A 19-year-old girl named Mabel Andrews was dancing in a Soho nightclub with her boyfriend, Billy Clifford, when flames suddenly burst from her back, chest, and shoulders, igniting her hair. She died on the way to the hospital. Her boyfriend, who was badly burned trying to put her out, exploded. The Sheffield Independent reported Billy Jefferson, who waved a hand at some workmen as he drove, and then the Daily Telegraph reports that A.F. Smith of Birkenhead burst into flames in the cab of his lorry, but the fire was confined to the cab and did not originate in the cushions of his seat. A coroner's jury was unable to determine the cause of the accident. Professor Robin Beach, formerly of the Polytechnic Institute of Brooklyn, has made a study of beings who are capable of building an enormous static charge. He tested already voltammeter charges in volts circumstances. Herman was seriously injured when he unscrewed the cap of his car battery. An electrical discharge from his dry fingers exploded the hydrogen escaping from the battery and blew acid in his face. Most people, says Professor Beach, and understanding with perspiration, not conducive to a buildup of static. Even supposing that she built up some immense charge and brushed against an object that was earthed, there should only have been a brief flash, not an explosion of flames. And how could a man burst into flames in the cab of his lorry when the rubber tires insulate it from the earth? And that right there is where I am going to stop. I know it seems like it's kind of in the middle of a subject, but it's just physically a good place to stop in the text because he left an extra space there, so it's easy to find. Well, I'm going to stop there. That'll be about 26 pages. No. 24 pages for next time to finish up that chapter. And we've only got one more book, and we'll be... So between now and tomorrow, I will come up with the 4 books that I want to put on my poll. Yeah, we'll figure out the next book. So I will see you all then. Have a good night.
My heart is bleeding. I know the pieces. One is broken, one is beat. Because I have no eating head. Was it you have no